Have you ever wondered what happens when one person prays alone for someone who has turned completely away from God? Can the prayers of a single faithful spouse really reach someone whose mind is locked shut against heaven? Throughout history, countless families have silently carried the weight of a divided household. One believing, one doubting, one praying, one refusing. The pain does not fade easily because it touches the deepest mystery of human choice and divine mercy. In the spring of 1950 in Taranto, Italy, a woman named Maria sat beside her dying husband and faced this exact reality. Her husband, Paolo Negro, was a high school philosophy teacher. He held 2 university degrees, one in humanities from 1936, another in philosophy from 1940. His doctoral thesis was a formal denial of the existence of God. For over a decade, he had taught young minds to embrace atheism with intellectual certainty. Maria was the opposite of everything Paolo believed. Because she was an orphan, she had been raised by Carmelite nuns from infancy until age 22. Her faith was not theoretical. It was woven into her bones. She prayed constantly. She attended Mass. She lived the sacraments. And she married an atheist anyway. Together they built a home in Taranto. They had 2 children. But the divide between them remained. Paolo spoke about the universe without God. Maria spoke to God about Paolo every single day. Alone in her prayers, alone in her Mass attendance, alone in her hope. Then in early 1950, Paolo collapsed. Dry pleurisy invaded his lungs. Within weeks, his body began shutting down. His temperature spiked to 105 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 14 straight days. He became delirious. The doctors examined him and gave Maria the answer she dreaded. There is nothing more we can do. If you value documented stories of faith like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Colby Center for the Study of Creation, which published direct testimony from Santina Negro, Paolo's daughter, given at San Giovanni Rotondo on May 10, 2005, and from documented accounts preserved in Frs. Marcelino Jesenzaniro's collection, The Padre, St. Pio of Pietrelcina Testimonies, published by Our Lady of Grace Capuchin Friary. Now, back to the information. Maria prayed harder, but Paolo remained an atheist. Even dying, even burning with fever, he showed no interest in reconciliation with the Church. Maria was completely alone. Her husband would not pray. Her children were too young to understand. She had no spiritual support in her own home, just silence and sickness and the knowledge that time was running out. Then on one Saturday evening in April 1950, at exactly 10 in the evening, 2 men knocked on her door. 2 complete strangers. One was Otello Rizzoliti, a warrant officer in the Italian Navy. The other was Carlo Lusardi. Both wore serious expressions. Both stood at her threshold, insisting they needed to come inside immediately. Maria hesitated. She was alone with 2 small children and a dying husband. It was late at night. She had never seen these men before in her life. She asked them what they wanted. They answered with words that made no sense to her. Padre Pio has sent us. We have to say the rosary for the man here who is seriously ill. Maria had never even heard the name Padre Pio. She lived in Taranto, hundreds of miles south of San Giovanni Rotondo, where the Capuchin friar resided. She told the men to wait at the door. She went to Paolo's bedside and explained what the stranger said. They want to pray the rosary for you? Paolo, burning with fever and barely conscious, heard the word rosary. Something shifted. 4 years earlier, in 1946, Paolo had surprised everyone by requesting a meeting with Archbishop Bernardi of Taranto. He told the Archbishop he had seen a vision, a profile of the Blessed Virgin. After that vision, he began attending Mass sporadically, though he never spoke about why. Now, dying and delirious, he heard rosary and gave permission. Let them in. The 2 men entered. They knelt immediately. No introductions, no explanations, just prayer. Rizzoliti in his white Navy uniform and Lusardi beside him began reciting the rosary with absolute devotion. Their voices filled the room with Hail Marys. But something else filled the room too. Santina Negro, Paolo's daughter, was a child at the time. Decades later, she testified under oath about what happened next. She said she could see it as if it were yesterday. While the 2 men prayed on their knees, her father became agitated. He stared at the foot of his bed with wide eyes. Then he spoke to Maria. Send that hooded friar at the foot of the bed away. Maria saw nothing. She imagined her husband was hallucinating from the high fever. She said nothing. The 2 men finished the rosary. Before they left, they discreetly pressed money into Maria's hands. This is sent by Padre Pio for medicine. Buy penicillin. Maria had spent nearly all their savings trying to afford the expensive antibiotic. She had no idea how these strangers knew. What Maria did not know was that this moment represented the culmination of years of invisible spiritual warfare. While she had been praying alone, Padre Pio had been watching from San Giovanni Rotondo. He saw souls in need. He perceived when the moment was right for intervention. and he had been waiting for the precise instant when Paolo's defenses would finally crack. That Saturday night at 10 in the evening was not random. Paolo had been burning with a fever for 2 full weeks. For 14 consecutive days, his temperature stayed at 105 degrees. The doctors had given up. Maria had exhausted her financial resources, buying medicine that did not work. Paolo was delirious, hovering between life and death, his intellectual fortress crumbling under the assault of physical suffering. That was when Padre Pio moved, not before. Not when Paolo was still healthy and confident in his atheism. Not when Maria first started praying years earlier, but at the exact moment when Paolo's pride had been stripped away by illness and his mind was finally vulnerable to grace. Padre Pio sent 2 of his spiritual sons to pray the rosary, and Padre Pio himself appeared in bilocation at the foot of the bed, visible only to Paolo, witnessing the power of his wife's prayers finally breaking through. This reveals something crucial about how God answers the prayers of faithful spouses. The answer does not come on our timeline. It comes on God's timeline, and God's timing is always perfect. Maria had been praying for over a decade, 10 years, 3,650 days of prayers that seemed to accomplish nothing. Paolo's atheism never wavered during those years. His career flourished. His intellectual confidence grew. His rejection of God became more sophisticated and more deeply entrenched. But all of Maria's prayers were accumulating in heaven, every single one. Every morning Mass Maria attended while Paolo slept. Every evening Rosary Maria prayed while Paolo prepared his atheist lectures. Every whispered petition throughout the day when Maria saw her husband and felt the pain of their spiritual division. None of it was wasted. All of it was being stored, waiting for the right moment. The following Monday morning, Paolo's fever broke. His temperature returned to normal. The doctors were stunned. By Thursday, just 3 days later, Paolo insisted on traveling. He wanted to go to San Giovanni Rotondo. He wanted to meet the friar who had sent the men to pray for him. Risaliti and Lusardi returned and took Paolo by taxi to the train station in Taranto. They traveled together that evening and arrived at San Giovanni Rotondo late at night. They found lodging in a small white house on the right side of the road leading up to the friary. Paolo could barely walk, but he refused to rest. The next morning, Friday, the men brought Paolo to the sacristy where Padre Pio was hearing confessions. At the end of the morning confessions, Padre Pio emerged from behind the curtain that hid him from onlookers. He looked directly at Paolo Negro. Without introduction, without greeting, Padre Pio spoke first. "If you cry, I will not come to your house anymore." Paolo understood immediately. The hooded friar he had seen at the foot of his bed, the one he thought was a fever dream, that was Padre Pio. The saint had bilocated from San Giovanni Rotondo to Taranto on that Saturday night. He had stood invisible to everyone except Paolo. And now Padre Pio was telling him gently but firmly that tears of self-pity were useless. What Paolo needed was repentance. Paolo made his confession. His first confession in over a decade. Padre Pio heard every word. When it ended, Padre Pio looked at Paolo with immense tenderness. He said something that Santina Negro recorded years later. "Your wife never stopped praying for you. Not one single day. Every Mass, every rosary, every moment of your sickness. She prayed alone because you would not pray with her." Paolo left that confession completely changed. Santina testified that afterward, she often saw her father crying because of his past sins. He tried to make up for his years of atheism by leading people to God and to Padre Pio. The intellectual who had written a doctoral thesis denying God's existence became a man who could not stop speaking about God's mercy. But what really shattered him was realizing that Maria had carried the weight alone. All those years when he mocked her faith, all those mornings when she went to Mass without him, all those nights when she knelt by their bed and prayed while he slept or ignored her. She had never stopped. She never gave up. She prayed in complete isolation within her own marriage, and God heard every single word. This is what Padre Pio saw. Not just Paolo's conversion, but Maria's faithful endurance. One woman, alone in her home, sustaining her husband's soul with prayer he did not want and did not ask for. Padre Pio honored that. He told Paolo directly. He made sure Paolo understood that his healing, his conversion, his very life was the fruit of Maria's prayers. The power was not in Maria's eloquence. She was not a theologian. She did not debate with Paolo or try to argue him into belief. The power was in her constancy. She prayed when it made no visible difference. She prayed when Paolo's atheism seemed unshakable. She prayed when he was dying and still refusing God. She prayed alone. Maria's situation was particularly difficult because of who Paolo was. This was not a simple case of a husband who drifted away from childhood faith. This was a man who had actively constructed an intellectual fortress against God. In 1940, at age 44, Paolo completed his second doctoral degree specifically in philosophy. His thesis argued systematically that God was a human invention. He then spent the next decade teaching this philosophy to high school students in Taranto. Think about what Maria faced every single day. Her husband was not just indifferent to faith. He was professionally committed to destroying it in others. He stood in front of classrooms full of young people and taught them that everything Maria believed was superstition. He assigned readings that attacked the church. He graded papers that defended atheism. His entire career was built on the foundation of denying God's existence. Maria could not avoid this reality. Paolo brought his work home. He talked about his students. He prepared lectures at their dining table. She watched him refine his arguments against God while she tried to pray her rosary. She knew that while she was at daily Mass each morning, Paolo was preparing to teach young minds to reject everything the Mass represented. This was not a passive situation. Paolo was not merely absent from faith. He was actively working against it, and Maria was praying alone inside that hostile environment. No spiritual support from her husband, no partnership in raising their children in the faith. No ability to have meaningful conversations about God without triggering Paolo's intellectual defenses. She attended Mass alone every Sunday. The other wives at church sat with their husbands. Their families prayed together. Their homes had unity around faith. Maria had none of that. She walked into church alone. She sat in the pew alone. She received communion alone. And then she walked home to a husband who thought everything she just participated in was primitive nonsense for weak minds. The loneliness of that situation is difficult to overstate. Faith is meant to be shared. Marriage is meant to be a partnership. Raising children is meant to be a joint effort. Maria had to do all of it in isolation while her husband actively undermined her efforts. When she taught their children to pray, Paolo's atheism hung in the air like a question mark over everything she said. When she took them to Mass, they came home to a father who did not go and did not think it mattered. And yet Maria never stopped, not for one day. Not even when Paolo's reputation as a brilliant atheist philosopher grew. Not even when his former students would visit their home and discuss their own rejection of faith. Not even when every visible indicator suggested that her prayers were accomplishing absolutely nothing. She kept going, Mass every day, rosary every night, constant prayers whispered throughout her daily routines. All of it offered alone for a husband who would have mocked her if he knew how much she was praying for his soul. Now, let me pause here for another message. If you value factual history like this, make sure to subscribe. This channel depends on your support. Also drop a comment telling us which city you are watching from. All of this content is carefully researched using documented testimonies, including the sworn statement of Santina Negro. From May 10, 2005 at San Giovanni Rotondo, preserved in official Padre Pio archives. Now back to the story. Padre Pio saw this pattern repeat constantly. Throughout his 50 years at San Giovanni Rotondo, from 1916 until his death in 1968, he encountered thousands of families torn apart by unbelief. Husbands who abandoned the faith, wives who stopped praying, children who walked away from the church. And in the middle of all that pain, he saw the ones who stayed, the ones who prayed alone. He told his spiritual children again and again that these solitary prayers were the most powerful force in the spiritual world, not because the person praying was holy, not because their faith was perfect, but because God honors persistence. God honors the spouse who keeps praying when everyone else has given up. God honors the mother who keeps a rosary under her pillow and whispers intentions at 3 a.m. when no one is watching. God honors the father who attends daily Mass for a son who has not set foot in a church for 20 years. Padre Pio said these prayers pile up in heaven like ammunition. Every Hail Mary that feels useless, every Mass attendance that changes nothing visible, every moment of loneliness and discouragement while everyone around you lives as if God does not exist. None of it is wasted. All of it is being stored. And when the moment comes, when the person you have been praying for is finally ready, all those prayers come crashing down at once like a dam breaking. That is what happened to Paolo Negro. He thought his healing was sudden. He thought his vision of the Blessed Virgin in 1946 came out of nowhere. He thought the appearance of Padre Pio at the foot of his bed during his illness was random grace. But it was not sudden. It was the cumulative weight of Maria's prayers finally breaking through. This is the part that most people miss. They focus on the miracle of the bilocation. They marvel at Padre Pio appearing in 2 places at once. They talk about the supernatural phenomena. But Padre Pio himself always redirected attention away from the miraculous signs and toward the hidden sacrifices. He wanted people to see Maria. The woman, no one noticed. The wife who had no spiritual gifts, no visions, no mystical experiences, just daily fidelity and complete isolation. Padre Pio told Paolo this directly because Paolo needed to understand the cost. His wife had paid an enormous spiritual price for his soul. While he pursued intellectual atheism and taught students to reject God, Maria carried the burden. She bore the loneliness of a divided home. She endured the pain of watching her husband lead their children toward unbelief while she tried to pull them back toward faith. She accepted the reality that her marriage would never have spiritual unity in this life unless God intervened. And God did intervene, but not because Paolo deserved it, not because Paolo sought it. God intervened because Maria asked, over and over and over, alone, without support, without encouragement, without any sign that her prayers were working. This is what makes Maria's story so important. She is not famous. There are no statues of Maria Negro. There is no feast day celebrating her constancy. Most people who hear about Paolo's conversion never even learn her name, but Padre Pio saw her. And Padre Pio made sure Paolo saw her too. When Paolo made his confession that Friday morning in April 1950, Padre Pio did not just absolve him and send him away. He spoke to Paolo about Maria's sacrifice. He told Paolo that his wife's prayers had literally kept his soul alive when it should have been lost. Padre Pio wanted Paolo to go home and look at his wife differently, not as the woman he had tolerated despite her annoying religiosity, but as the woman who had saved him. And Paolo did exactly that. According to Santina's testimony, her father returned to Taranto a different man. He cried frequently over his past sins. He spoke openly about God's mercy to anyone who would listen, but more than that, he honored his wife. He finally understood what she had done. He finally saw the loneliness she had endured. He finally recognized that her prayers, offered in secret and in silence, had been the most powerful thing happening in their marriage for over a decade. Paolo's transformation was total. The man who had written his doctoral thesis denying God's existence now could not stop talking about God's mercy. The professor who had taught hundreds of students to embrace atheism now used every opportunity to lead people back to faith. His intellectual abilities, which he had once weaponized against religion, now became tools for evangelization. But what struck everyone who knew him was his constant reference to his wife. Paolo did not present his conversion as a personal achievement. He did not frame it as an intellectual breakthrough where he finally figured out the truth. Instead, he always pointed to Maria. He told people openly that his wife had saved him through her prayers. He described the years of her lonely faithfulness. He spoke about her daily mass attendance while he slept, her constant rosaries while he mocked her faith, her refusal to give up even when every rational calculation said her efforts were pointless. This humility was itself evidence of profound conversion. The old Paolo, the atheist professor, would never have given credit to anyone else, especially not for something as supposedly imaginary as prayer. But the new Paolo understood that he had been on the receiving end of a spiritual rescue operation he had done nothing to deserve. His wife had fought for his soul while he actively tried to destroy his own faith and the faith of others. She had borne the weight alone. She had paid the price, and God had honored her persistence. Santina testified that she often saw her father weeping over his past. These were not the tears of self-pity that Padre Pio had warned against when he said, "If you cry, I will not come to your house anymore." These were tears of gratitude and contrition. Gratitude that God had mercy when he deserved judgment. Contrition that he had made his wife carry such a heavy burden alone for so many years. And determination to spend whatever time he had left making amends by leading others to the faith he had once denied. This pattern of conversion, from intellectual pride to humble gratitude, is exactly what Padre Pio saw over and over in the confessional. He spent 19 hours every single day hearing confessions for 50 years. From 1916, when he arrived at San Giovanni Rotondo, until 1968, when he died, Padre Pio listened to the stories of broken families, divided marriages, and lost souls. And in the middle of all that brokenness, he consistently saw the same heroes. The faithful spouses who never stopped praying, the mothers who attended daily mass for wayward children, the fathers who made holy hours for wives who had abandoned the faith, the grandparents who said rosaries for entire families that had drifted away from God. Padre Pio honored these hidden prayers more than the supernatural phenomena that made him famous. People came to San Giovanni Rotondo to see his stigmata. They wanted to witness his bilocations. They hoped for miraculous healings. They sought prophetic words about their future. But Padre Pio consistently redirected their attention to the simple, hidden, daily faithfulness of ordinary people who prayed when no one was watching. He told his spiritual children again and again that these prayers were the foundation of everything. The miracles happened because someone was praying. The conversions broke through because someone had been praying for years. The healings manifested because someone had offered their suffering in prayer. Behind every visible supernatural event was an invisible army of faithful people praying alone. And Padre Pio made sure everyone understood that those prayers were what mattered most. This is the hidden truth about faithful spouses who pray alone. They are not praying into a void. They are not wasting their time. They are engaging in the most effective spiritual warfare that exists. Because when one person in a marriage refuses to pray, the other person's prayers carry double weight. They cover both souls. They hold the door open for grace to enter, even when one person is actively trying to slam it shut. Padre Pio understood this because he spent 19 hours a day in the confessional. 19 hours every single day for decades. He heard the same story thousands of times. A wife comes to confession weeping. Her husband has abandoned the faith. Or a husband comes broken. His wife has turned to New Age spirituality and refuses Mass. Or parents come desperate. Their adult children have left the church and will not speak to them about God. And what did Padre Pio tell them every single time? Pray. Do not stop. Do not give up. Do not believe the lie that your prayers are useless just because you see no immediate results. Your prayers are piling up in heaven, every single one. And when the moment comes, when that soul is finally ready to turn back to God, all your prayers will be there waiting. Like a massive reserve of grace ready to flood in the second the door opens even a crack. Maria Negro proved this. Paolo's door had been bolted shut for over a decade. He had an intellectual framework that explained away every aspect of faith. He had convinced himself that God was a psychological projection, a primitive superstition for weak minds. His entire professional identity was built on atheism. He taught it. He defended it. He lived it. But Maria's prayers were stronger than all of that. Not because she prayed eloquently, not because she had special access to God, but because she never stopped. Even when it seemed completely pointless. Even when Paolo mocked her. Even when their children saw the division and started to doubt. Even when she had to attend Mass alone every Sunday while her husband stayed home, she kept praying. And on that Saturday night in April 1950, when two strangers knocked on her door at 10 in the evening claiming Padre Pio sent them, she finally saw the fruit. Not the full fruit yet. Paolo was still too sick to fully understand, but she saw the door crack open. She saw Paolo allow the rosary to be prayed over him. She saw his fever break after the prayers. She saw him insist on traveling to San Giovanni Rotondo, even though he could barely walk. That was Maria's victory. The moment her husband said yes to the rosary. The moment he allowed strangers into their home to pray over him. The moment he chose, even in delirium and weakness, to open himself to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about God. Padre Pio saw that moment coming long before it arrived. That is why he sent Risaliti and Lusardi. That is why he appeared at the foot of Paolo's bed and by location. That is why he told Paolo directly on Friday morning, "If you cry, I will not come to your house anymore." Padre Pio was saying, "I already came to your house. I was there Saturday night. I watched your wife's prayers finally break through your defenses. Now stop crying and start living the faith she's been carrying alone all these years." And Paolo did. For the rest of his life, he carried the memory of that realization. His wife had prayed alone. She had borne the weight of their spiritual division without complaint, without bitterness, without giving up. And her prayers had literally saved his life and his soul. This is not a metaphor. This is not religious poetry. This is documented reality. Santina Negro testified to these facts under oath at San Giovanni Rotondo in 2005. The Colby Center for the Study of Creation published her testimony. Professor Marcelino Iacenzanero preserved it in the official archives of the Capuchin Friary of Our Lady of Grace. These are not vague family stories passed down through generations and distorted over time. These are concrete, documented facts given by Paolo's own daughter, who witnessed everything as a child. Maria Negro prayed alone for over a decade, for an atheist husband who rejected everything she believed. And her prayers worked, not in the way she probably imagined, not in some gentle, gradual softening of his heart. But in a single explosive moment of grace when God sent a saint in bilocation to the foot of her husband's deathbed, and two strangers knocked on her door at 10 at night with a rosary and money for medicine. That is how God answers the prayers of faithful spouses who never stop praying alone. He waits until the moment is exactly right. He waits until every other possibility has been exhausted. He waits until the person praying has proven beyond any doubt that they will not quit. And then he moves with overwhelming power. Padre Pio spent 50 years watching this pattern repeat. He saw it in Maria Negro. He saw it in countless other families who came to him broken and desperate. He saw the faithful spouse, usually the wife, but sometimes the husband, carrying the spiritual burden alone, attending Mass alone, praying the rosary alone, making sacrifices alone, offering suffering alone, all while the other spouse lived as if God did not exist. And Padre Pio always told them the same thing. Your prayers are not wasted. Your sacrifices are not meaningless. Your loneliness is not pointless. You are doing the most important work that exists. You are holding the door open for grace. You're keeping the channel clear between heaven and your spouse's soul. You are fighting a battle that no one else can see, but that determines everything. This is why Padre Pio honored Maria so publicly. He could have simply heard Paolo's confession and sent him home with a blessing, but instead he made a point of telling Paolo exactly what his wife had done. He made sure Paolo understood that Maria's prayers were the reason Paolo was still alive, and the reason he was standing in that sacristy making his first confession in over a decade. Padre Pio wanted Paolo to go home and thank his wife, not just with words, but with his life, by living the faith she had carried alone, by praying with her instead of ignoring her, by raising their children in the church instead of teaching them atheism, by becoming the spiritual partner she had been praying for all those years, and that is exactly what Paolo did. Santina testified that her father cried often over his past sins, but those were not tears of self-pity. They were tears of gratitude, gratitude that God had mercy, gratitude that Padre Pio intervened, but most of all, gratitude that Maria had never stopped praying, even when every reasonable person would have given up, even when Paolo's atheism seemed permanent and unchangeable, even when there was zero evidence that her prayers were accomplishing anything. She kept going. Alone. The word alone is crucial here. Maria was not part of a prayer group supporting each other through shared struggles. She was not attending marriage conferences with other Catholic wives, dealing with unbelieving husbands. She was not getting encouragement from friends who understood her pain. She was isolated in her own home, with an atheist husband and 2 small children and no one to share the spiritual burden. That is the reality for millions of faithful spouses today. They pray alone. They go to Mass alone. They make decisions about their children's faith formation alone, while their spouse either opposes them or remains indifferent. They carry the weight of spiritual division in their marriage without support, without encouragement, without any visible sign that their efforts matter. Padre Pio's message to all of them is this: your prayers matter more than you can possibly imagine. Every single one. Every Mass you attend alone. Every rosary you pray while your spouse watches television or sleeps or works. Every sacrifice you make without recognition. Every moment of loneliness and discouragement. All of it is being gathered in heaven. All of it is building toward the moment when God will move in your spouse's life with overwhelming power. You cannot control when that moment comes. Maria could not control when Paolo would finally open his heart to grace. She could not force the timing. She could not manipulate God into moving faster. All she could do was keep praying, keep attending Mass, keep living her faith visibly and consistently, even when it seemed to make no difference. And that is all God asks from faithful spouses who pray alone. Not that they convert their spouse through perfect arguments, not that they create the perfect home environment that makes faith irresistible, not that they sacrifice their own sanity trying to force spiritual change, just that they keep praying, keep trusting, keep holding the door open for grace, and let God do the rest. Maria Nigro proved that this works. Her husband was as hard a case as exists. University educated, intellectually committed to atheism, professionally invested in teaching others to reject God, surrounded by a culture that respected his position, living in a time and place where atheism was considered sophisticated and faith was considered superstitious. But none of that mattered, because Maria kept praying, and God honored her persistence, not because she was perfect, not because she never doubted or struggled or felt discouraged, but because she refused to quit. She chose to believe, against all evidence, that her prayers were reaching heaven and that God would answer in his own time. On that Friday morning in April 1950, when Paolo stood in the sacristy at San Giovanni Rotondo, every prayer Maria had ever prayed came crashing down at once. Every Mass she attended alone. Every rosary she prayed in secret. Every tear she shed over her divided marriage. Every moment she felt abandoned and isolated and hopeless. All of it converged in that one moment when Padre Pio looked at Paolo and said, "Your wife never stopped praying for you." That sentence carried the weight of a decade of solitary faithfulness. It carried the weight of Maria's choice to keep believing when belief seemed foolish. It carried the weight of her refusal to accept that her marriage would remain spiritually divided forever. It carried the weight of her trust that God heard her even when nothing changed. And Paolo heard that weight. He understood what it meant. He went home and looked at Maria with completely different eyes, not as the religious woman he tolerated, but as the woman who had saved him through her prayers. The woman who had borne the spiritual burden of their entire family alone while he actively worked against her efforts. The woman who had loved him enough to keep praying even when he gave her every reason to give up. This is the power of one faithful spouse who never stops praying alone. Not dramatic, not visible, not celebrated or recognized by anyone except God. But absolutely devastating to the forces of darkness that want to destroy marriages and separate souls from God. Because when one person refuses to stop praying, the enemy cannot win. The door stays open, grace keeps flowing. And eventually, in God's perfect timing, the breakthrough comes. Maria Nigro's story is not unique. It is being lived out right now in millions of homes around the world. A Catholic wife praying for her non-Catholic husband, a believing husband praying for his agnostic wife, parents praying for adult children who have abandoned the faith, children praying for parents who have grown cold toward God, all of them alone, all of them wondering if their prayers matter, all of them tempted to give up because nothing seems to change. Padre Pio's message to every single one of them is clear: do not stop. Your prayers are more powerful than you know. They are piling up in heaven. They are keeping the door open for grace. They are preparing the way for the moment when God will move with overwhelming power in the life of the person you love. You cannot see that moment coming. You cannot control when it arrives. You cannot force it to happen faster. But you can keep praying. You can keep trusting. You can keep choosing to believe that God hears you even when every circumstance suggests your prayers are useless. Because that is what Maria did. And her husband, the atheist philosophy professor who denied God's existence in his doctoral thesis, died reconciled to the church, weeping over his sins, spending his final years trying to lead others to faith and to Padre Pio, all because his wife never stopped praying, alone. On April 19th, 1950, when Paolo Negro arrived at San Giovanni, Rotondo barely able to walk, he expected to thank Padre Pio for sending the men with the rosary. What he got instead was a confrontation with the truth about his own marriage. Padre Pio did not let Paolo focus on the miraculous bilocation or the supernatural healing. Padre Pio redirected everything back to Maria. Your wife prayed. She never stopped. She carried this burden alone while you rejected God. Now go home and honor that sacrifice with your life. That is the final word on faithful spouses who pray alone. Their prayers are not background noise in God's economy. They are front and center. They are the most powerful force operating in their marriage. They are the reason breakthroughs happen. They are the reason souls turn back to God after years of hardness. They are the reason families stay together when everything suggests they should fall apart. Pray alone if you must. But do not stop. Do not believe the lie that your prayers do not matter. Do not accept the discouragement that whispers your efforts are pointless. God sees every prayer. God honors every sacrifice. And when the moment comes, when the person you love is finally ready, all your prayers will be there waiting. Like a flood held back by a dam that finally breaks and rushes in with overwhelming power. Maria Negro proved it, and Padre Pio made absolutely certain that everyone who heard Paolo's story understood exactly who was responsible for his conversion. Not Padre Pio, not the miraculous bilocation, not the supernatural healing, but Maria, the woman who prayed alone, the woman no one noticed. The woman who carried the weight in silence and refused to quit. Her prayers saved her husband's life and soul, and they stand as permanent testimony to the power of one faithful spouse who never stops praying alone.